Thank you for joining me. I'm Dr. Philip Macmillan, and I have been speaking with experts across the world for many, many years, since the beginning of the pandemic. And one of them I have spoken to, I think I have probably had the most interviews with Geert Vanden Bossche. The only other person I've spoken to more was probably Dr. Shetty, and I've spoken to him on many occasions. So this is important because I haven't spoken to Gert for almost 7 months as things continued along, and I was getting more and more worried. And then he started to come back again to start to speak, and I thought, I have got to get him because so many people are worried about where we are. Nobody is talking about what is going on. Nobody's giving insights. Public health has gone silent. We're hearing about more and more viruses circulating. Nothing seems to make sense. Well, no one better to try and see if they can dissect what is going on than Geert Vanden Bossche. So thank you very much, Geert. And as usual, could you just give a quick introduction to our guests?
Yeah, sure. First, Philip, thanks for having me. My background is originally veterinary medicine, and after my studies, I worked in the clinical field for about 5-6 years at the University of Berlin in essentially equine medicine and surgery. But then, by a pure coincidence of a number of events, I all of a sudden switched then to the field of human infectious diseases, working primarily in the field of virology and immunology and molecular biology. That was still at the University of Berlin, and then later on also at the University of Hohenheim, Stuttgart, where I specialized in environmental microbiology and environmental virology. So after my academic career, I then moved on to work in industry, and I worked for a number of vaccine companies, biologicals, where I worked as well in the late development as in the early development, as for example, project manager. Also in the research department, where I was responsible for, was heading up, in fact, the adjunct platform at, for example, GSK, and also the platform for alternative delivery. Moved on after about 10 years to Novartis Vaccines and Diagnostics at the West Coast in the United States, and Siena in Italy. And where again I was primarily working on adjuvants, alternative deliveries, always related to vaccines. Then later on also with Solvay Biologicals, where I was involved in the flu business. Then finally I changed a little bit my perspective and joined a number of public global health organizations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in Seattle, where I was a senior program officer in vaccine discovery. And later on also with the worked with the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunizations in Geneva. And while I was doing this, I was also running my own company that was in fact focusing on a completely novel approach to vaccines, specializing in fact on natural killer cell-based vaccines. And it's in fact gathering or bringing all this knowledge together. I felt, of course, very, very much interested when the COVID-19 pandemic started. I was, of course, it blew me away when then I heard that the WHO recommended to do mass vaccination whilst the pandemic had already started. And so all they had was a proposal for prophylactic vaccines, regardless of the modern technology, RNA, etc. It's prophylactic vaccines that have, of course, during a pandemic, no sterilizing immunity. And for me, it was sure that this could only drive immune escape. And this has been my main topic of interest and also of debate during the pandemic, and I'm still following the consequences of the immune escape, as we will probably discuss a little bit today. Over.
Excellent, Geert. I mean, we've got so many people. I've been trying to see if I could put some of the special messages on from where people are in the world so that we can see we've got quite a lot of people here with us. So a lot of people want to know what's going on. And I guess one of the starting points is that towards the middle of 2024, you were very concerned that there was going to be a significant shift in terms of illness for the population. And where are you now with those thoughts? Because we are now beyond that period. I mean, people are still getting sick, but it doesn't seem to be as frightening as maybe they had thought. What are your thoughts now about where things are?
Yeah, well, Philip, my thoughts back still 1 year ago were that the speed of the evolution of the virus was going just to continue and even accelerate. And remember, we have seen within 2 years after the outbreak, we have seen dramatic changes in the behavior of the virus, increasing resistance to neutralizing antibodies, increasing infectiousness, and then with the advent of Omicron, I mean, that was very spectacular. All of a sudden, a huge amount of mutations that then made the virus responsible for large-scale vaccine breakthrough infections, etc. So it was very clear that under immune pressure, the virus was very rapidly evolving and primarily changing its spike protein. So and especially the receptor binding domain. Remember, the neutralizing antibodies induced by the vaccine were primarily directed against its receptor binding domain. So it was not a coincidence that mutations, dominant and co-dominant mutations, essentially took place in that region of the virus of spike protein. And so I thought, well, this is not going well, because if the limit of infectiousness will be reached somewhere where the virus has difficulty to increase its intrinsic infectiousness and to increase transmissibility from one host to another, then the only way it can survive is to shift to enhanced virulence, so that it can spread within the host from one organ to the other and cause disseminated viral spread within the body, which is, of course, very catastrophic. And so that is what my timeline was based upon. And frankly speaking, I thought that my timeline for this disaster happening was pretty conservative. But then it happened not, it's not to pan out as I had predicted. So something in my reasoning was failing. Was missing, I would say. And today, because the question is, where are you today? Well, today, my predictions are still exactly the same. I will not change those, not because I'm stubborn. I used to be stubborn, but I'm no longer stubborn. But because all biological evidence is pointing into that direction. But nevertheless, I wanted to understand why all of a sudden does this pandemic seem to pause, in a sense that the high speed of changes that we have seen in the virus and the dramatic changes were no longer happening. Of course, there have been, the virus has continued to evolve, but the changes were like incremental increase in infectiousness, slight increases of infectiousness, no longer the spectacular changes that we have seen, for example, with Omicron, etc. And I wanted to understand what is this due to, that all of a sudden, after this kind of like exponential evolution, we have reached a kind of plateau where there isn't obviously not much going on, to an extent even that some people think that the pandemic is dying out, that it is waning, that it is, going to transition into endemicity. And I found out that this is completely wrong, that it is completely misleading, and maybe we can discuss this a little bit. But this was the major reason why I decided to share my thoughts on my platform, and maybe also more broadly. So the thing is, the final conclusion remains exactly the same. All biological evidence is there, but indeed, it's going to move much slower in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic. Whereas we see that in the meantime, during this break of the pandemic, a lot of other diseases are now developing, and even other infections, as we see today. Over.
Yeah, I was going to say, one of the problems I think is that there is a perception as to how disease will manifest with this virus. And what I'm learning from observing patients at the front, and because I am so COVID focused, I usually quiz patients about what I call prodrome symptoms when they're unwell. And consistently, what I've been finding is that for many people, there seems to be a period of time where they had what sounds like a very mild infection, where they've only had just fatigue or something, a few weeks before, and then subsequently to have significant clinical presentation. So my feeling is that actually your prediction in terms of the evasion with regards to the virus is occurring. Is just that the clinical way patients present doesn't yet hit a consistent pattern, and it makes it really really difficult because, as I said, we have just had a period of time where we have had levels of COVID circulation higher than it has been probably from even 2022, and yet people seem to be at the moment okay, but I know that this doesn't make sense in the short, medium, or long term. So something is brewing. The question is, how does it present and what does it mean? How does the science pan out? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, my thoughts are very clear and straightforward on this. So what we have seen essentially after Omicron, and Omicron, frankly speaking, has been for me a very important but dramatic event, and it has been for me also a point of no return, in a sense that with Omicron, we got vaccine breakthrough infections, remember. And the vaccine breakthrough infections, they have been particularly important in a sense that they have led to immune refocusing. So now, what is immune refocusing? I explained this several times, but basically, it leads to immune dysregulation. So that means that the immune response that was induced by this vaccine breakthrough infections was much broader. Remember, I mean, public health authorities and a lot of scientists were very much excited about this broad immune responses. So they were broadly neutralizing immune responses. And so they were covering a number of different variants at the same time. And so people got excited about this. But guess what? I mean, these broad immune responses are also cross-reactive with other components in the body, for example. The broader you make the immune response, okay, the more variants you can cover, but the less specific the immune response. So with these vaccine breakthrough infections and the immune refocusing, automatically, we were also having much broader immune responses that to some extent were, first of all, less functional. And we have seen that those neutralizing antibodies after vaccine breakthrough infections, and also with the, so to say, Omicron-based vaccines, were inducing antibodies that were declining much faster. Their neutralizing effect was declining much faster. And secondarily, this broadly, these broad antibodies or broad immune responses have most likely also been interacting with other components of the body. That leads, of course, to dysregulation of the immune response. If you want, you ideally want to have an immune response very specific. As a vaccinologist, that's what every vaccinologist is in fact aware of, is trying to do, is to have a very specific, well-targeted immune response. If you make this broader, there is a high likelihood of having undesirable immune responses. And remember, for example, this is one of the issues with adjuvants, because that's also what adjuvants do. They broaden the immune response. So now, if you start to have immune responses, be it antibodies, be it T cells, that are no longer entirely specific, but that can cross-react with other components, that is what we, as a result of immune refocusing, that is what we call dysregulation of the immune response. And this dysregulation has certainly led to a lot of immune pathology. And this immune pathology, remember, we started to see this after the vaccine breakthrough infections caused by the Omicron variants. And of course, this can affect T cells, this can affect antibodies, this can affect effector T cells, this can affect regulatory T cells. And we also know that in all cases of immune inflammatory events, in all cases of autoimmune disease, for example, or all cases of immune pathology, you will always have T cells that are evolved, CD4 T cells, for example. You start to induce T cells that are no longer killing the virus. You start to induce antibodies that are no longer neutralizing the virus. Remember, all the debate we had about IgG4 antibodies, about antibodies that were no longer neutralizing, but only to some extent inhibiting the infection. The affinity was lower, the functionality was lower, etc., etc. And this, of course, this derailment of the immune response leads to immune pathology when it affects, for example, regulatory T cells. It can lead, of course, to the resurgence of cancers. It can lead to the resurgence of chronic infectious diseases. That's also what we have been seeing: Epstein-Barr, cytomegalovirus, even tuberculosis, etc., that flare up again, a number of chronic infections. And that is what has now, in fact, become the dominant picture in this field. It's no longer the acute self-limiting COVID infection. By the way, that infection itself has now also more and more shifted to chronicity with regard to the symptomatology of COVID. And it is now flanked by a number of diseases that have, in fact, indirectly been caused by the derailed immune response that is the result of immune refocusing. And the immune refocusing is the result of the Omicron-based vaccinations and the vaccine breakthrough infections. Over.
Yeah, so I wanted to clarify something there because, in effect, a lot of people have been using the terminology of almost vaccine induced immune suppression, where what we're seeing is a broad failure of immunity. Certainly not in all of the vaccinated cohort, but certainly more evident in highly vaccinated regions. One of the pieces is certainly about increased focusing of the immune response. But as I've been saying for some time, the virus, this SARS-CoV-2 virus, also can enter cells using CD147, which means that it targets immune cells as well. And so, would that be a reasonable explanation for now, in effect, we're seeing in vulnerable individuals a failure of their immune system, which is what is bringing on many of the infections that we're seeing?
Hmm. Well, I personally, I still think that the cases you are alluding to are the consequence of immune derailment, or even with regard to SARS-CoV-2. You know, people always think about these receptors as being an all or having an all or nothing effect. You know, you have the right receptor binding domain and then the right receptor, and then it will bind and it will enter into the cell, etc. There are other mechanisms that can facilitate, even if the presence of specific receptors that can facilitate entry of cells. For example, and these are all the nuances that nobody's talking about, or very few people are talking about. This, what about immune complexes, for example? What happens when antibodies can no longer neutralize the virus, so they have a decreased functionality, but they can still bind to the virus. By binding to the virus, they build a complex, and that complex can to some extent also facilitate viral entry, for example, even in cells that have no or very, very low density of the receptors. That is what I did my PhD thesis on. For example, I treated viruses, the surface of viruses, with certain components. And by doing that, I managed to make these viruses enter into cells that did not have the specific receptor for the virus. So it's not like the virus can enter into certain of these organ cells because there is no immunity. No, that is, in my opinion, not the case. The immune response is not the right one. It is derailed, and instead of inhibiting the virus by, for example, neutralizing it, or in case the virus entered already the cell, instead of killing the virus-infected cells, it will in fact expedite or enhance. The nicest example is antibody-dependent enhancement of infection or antibody-dependent enhancement of disease. So abnormal, suboptimal interactions between the immune system and the virus can even expedite, can facilitate, can enhance viral infection and propagation. So for me, this is all within the context of immune dysregulation and immune and dysfunctional immune responses that are the result of the vaccine breakthrough infections and the vaccination.
I've gotten one of these slides. I've made hundreds of
Yeah.
slides. And as you were talking, I fished out this one. And this one was supposed to be demonstrating the IgG4 antibodies binding to the spike protein. It's not quite the right size image. But what you're saying is that these antibodies, these non-neutralizing antibodies that bind to, say, the spike or different parts of the virus, can't completely neutralize them. And then you end up with a whole globule of antibody plus virus, which then gets picked up by the immune system. Is that kind of like what you mean?
Yeah, but it is, in fact, Philip, this is extremely complex. You are giving here the example of the IgG4 antibodies, but I would say any situation where you have an immune response I would say immune effectors, and immune effectors can be antibodies, can also be T cells, for example, that interact with the pathogen or with a pathogen infected cell. They can alter, of course, the level of protection, even to an extent where the infection is enhanced, is facilitated, and even to the extent where other immune responses, or I mean immune responses against other agents, against other pathogens, are also affected. You have also to consider that when you use all these immunological resources, in fact, for bad purposes, because, in fact, they are not doing the right thing. So it's a kind of decoy effect where many of these immunological resources are targeted at the wrong target. So then these resources are no longer available to protect against other pathogens. And that is where you could begin to see a certain deficiency of immune defense when, for example, the immune system is overwhelmingly concentrating on something that is wrong, that should not be the target, and it then has not sufficient resources to fight what it should really be targeting, foreign substances, pathogens, etc. So this is a very complex interplay, but the consequence is always the same, that the immune system is not working properly, and an immune system that does not work properly has very, very severe consequences. I'm always giving, and in the longer term, because once you prime, it's like for the rest of your life. And this priming is something people very often forget, because what it does prime, it generates memory. So that means you get reinfected by SARS-CoV-2. And even if that infection is pretty harmless in terms of, the immediate symptomatology, what it will do, it will recall the dysregulated immune responses. It will recall the previous immune responses that have been primed and which were putting, in fact, the immune system on the wrong track. These wrong immune responses will be recalled all the time, every single time people get infected. And, due to this boost effect of these detrimental immune responses, of course, the inflammatory and the autoimmune and immune pathology will just become worse, right? So it's the indirect effect. So it's not only the acute self-limiting effect or the acute symptomatology that we have been seeing at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, but after Omicron and vaccine breakthrough infections, the disease pattern, as you pointed out correctly, was more shifting towards diseases that were not typically caused by the virus itself, but by the detrimental consequences of the immune derailment that it has caused after the vaccine breakthrough infection.
In a sense, as I was trying to work out an analogy so that the audience gets some of the thoughts, it's kind of like having your army. When we were thinking of the Second World War, half of the approach was to do D-Day in a location where he didn't have the troops. And so if you imagine that his troops, even though they were there, were diverted somewhere else, then it opens the door for better attacks from other angles, simply because the immune system has become derailed. It's no longer focused where it should be, and therefore that individual or that immune system is vulnerable to more attacks, because we are seeing lots of cases. The cases are rising with flu, with RSV, with mycoplasma, norovirus, now the human metapneumovirus. It's just case after case, and there is a complete silence from public health on these things. There is no attempt to try and explain what's going on. COVID is, they're giving the impression that COVID is now endemic. It's no big deal. It's kind of like a background infection, no problem. But yet we're having cases that are way above what you would expect for endemic, and associated all of these viral infections. Is it just that they can't explain it and they're afraid of being wrong? What is the silence about?
Well, the silence, Philip, I've been telling this from the very beginning, nothing about conspiracy here. But unfortunately, everything has to do with incompetence. And I mean, the incompetence is very, very obvious, because these systems are so complex. They relate to immunology, they relate to vaccinology, they relate to virology, they relate even to, when we talk about these interactions with the antibodies and the complex building, and it's even biophysics involved, right? And I'm always saying, in contrast to the public health authorities, maybe, I'm not the expert in all of these fields, but I've learned to connect the dots. And that is precisely what they are unable to do. They have not the capacity, they have not the ability to connect the dots. And that is, of course, disastrous, because if you zoom in on each of these diseases out of context, if you don't see the broader picture, if you don't see the forest for the trees, what they are saying is, oh, there is a new infectious disease, or there is an epidemic of RSV, of influenza, and of metapneumonia virus. So what we need to do is to vaccinate, right? And they start vaccinating, not realizing that by doing this, they are making things much, much worse. So I give one example. We now see kind of like surges in several different countries. It's like a multi-country epidemic of RSV, seasonal flu, the metapneumonia virus, etc. And so they don't realize, of course, what they don't realize is that the fact that SARS-CoV-2 has shifted from this typical acute self-limiting pattern to more chronicity, that by doing so, the cross-protective effect that an acute self-limiting viral infection has on other viral infections has disappeared. Remember, when we had SARS-CoV-2 that was dominating, we didn't see any of this stuff. We didn't see the seasonal flu, etc. Of course not, because the cells, the cytotoxic T cells, were so strongly involved in eliminating SARS-CoV-2, and they have also a cross-protective effect on flu. So they were to some extent also eliminating flu virus. So that has gone because the acute self-limiting pattern has disappeared for SARS-CoV-2. So these viruses have now, so to say, like free reign. That is one thing. The second is the SARS-CoV-2, although it was dominating for like 2-3 years, it didn't manage in highly vaccinated countries, it didn't manage to induce sufficient or train sufficiently the innate immune system. Why was this? Well, either people had relatively high titers of antibodies, and the antibodies were already capturing the virus before it entered into the cell, and so the innate immunity could not be trained. Or, as I just mentioned, after Omicron, we had the vaccine breakthrough infections, which accelerated the development of the virus and the propagation and the replication of the virus to an extent such that there was not enough time left to train the innate immune system. So these other viruses, RSV, the flu, pneumonia virus, that have always been circulating, now all of a sudden are no longer, so to say, outcompeted by the SARS-CoV-2 that has shifted to chronicity, but also they are now facing, in highly vaccinated countries, innate immune systems that have not been trained, right? And that is where you get this, of the same strains that circulated already many years ago, all of a sudden, they're now causing much more severe symptoms. And that is, of course, if you don't understand immunology, which the public health authorities do not, certainly not at the population level, you cannot connect the dots, and you take all these things separately, you zoom in, metapneumonia virus. I bet you, if we had a vaccine, they would already have recommended to use that vaccine, which basically makes things worse. It's disastrous. Incompetence.
A lot of people don't understand because your background, your work, everything you do is about making vaccines. And to say it seems it seems almost so refreshing to hear someone whose work is around this saying, actually be careful here with how you use the technology that I've worked all my life to create. I think this is part of the reason why you are so hard to silence, because it's clear that you're looking at it objectively, because if you were just looking at it from a financial or other point of view, you'd be saying, whoa, this is great, more vaccines for me.
Yeah, well, Philip, this is the thing that for me is completely, not understandable. When you talk about antibiotics, people will immediately realize, so antibiotics, right? I'm always saying, for example, an antibody or even a cytotoxic T cell it's killing life. It's an antibiotic. It's a natural antibiotic, if you like. So, you can compare this to some extent. Everybody understands that if you don't use antibiotics the right way, if you don't respect the protocol that you have, you take this during a certain period at a sufficiently high concentration, etc., you're going to end up with resistance, right? And all of a sudden, for vaccines that induce antibodies, frankly speaking, the vast majority of our vaccines simply work on inducing antibodies. And of course, they induce T cells, but these T cells are primarily there to help the antibody immune response, to help the maturation and the longevity, the specificity of the antibodies. So these antibodies, right? If you, for example, vaccinate people during a pandemic where the antibody titers are still not high enough because it takes 6 weeks or 4 weeks at least for antibodies to reach this high titers, that's where you have to boost. And before that level is achieved, before full functionality is achieved, you start already to confront the virus and to be exposed to the virus. Of course, that this is going to induce resistance and that the virus is going to escape. So that is so crystal clear for antibiotics. For vaccines, it's apparently not the case. Very clearly, I'm not generally against vaccines, but if you don't use them the right way, and if you don't understand to begin with what is going on and how the virus interacts with the immune system, then, and you simply say, oh, there is a new infection, I will use the vaccine, not realizing, remember now, for example, metapneumonia virus, seasonal influenza virus, RSV, etc., are spreading like hell. And now you would vaccinate people. I mean, this is just asking for huge problems and making the whole thing much more complex and much more dangerous also, right?
This is important stuff again, because at the moment the only push that is being done now, granted they've pulled back with regards to COVID vaccination. Certainly in the UK, it's only for the over 65s and the high risk. But in the US, they're still pushing it to the whole population. But on top of it, there seem to be more and more stories about, say, for instance, the bird flu, the risk of this bird flu epidemic, pandemic. A patient died in Louisiana. It's time, and I heard it recently on the news, someone pushing that give full authorization for these influenza vaccines so that they can be immediately put out to try and protect against the pandemic. Are you saying, based even on that experience in 2021, when you said the same thing, don't do that? Are you still in that kind of perspective?
Much more so. I am begging people, to not vaccinate against flu. And why is this? I mean, it's again simply, all 90% of my questions are based on one keyword, which is immunology. If you don't understand the immunology, stay away from vaccines, stay away from public health measures. What is happening is that the pandemic flu, it's a panzootic. It is spreading amongst all several different, animal species. And of course, it is also affecting, and humans are exposed as well, but the virus has yet not specifically adapted to the human receptors. And so what can happen? So then you say, okay, the virus has not adapted and there shouldn't be any cases, and certainly not severe cases. If you now imagine that people get vaccinated and, certainly in the first weeks, in the first months after the vaccination, for example, against seasonal flu, but even against avian flu, because, the expansion of the avian flu in these bird reservoirs, and even now in many other mammalian species, is huge. And so you have, of course, recombinations, you have all kinds of variants that are generated in these reservoirs. Now, you will vaccinate somebody with a certain type of flu, a certain type of seasonal flu, certain type of bird flu. The likelihood that this person will be exposed to a homologous, and I would say a very similar or identical flu virus is remote. And the nicest example is if you get vaccinated with seasonal flu, that is what these authorities are now recommending, and you get exposed to bird flu, to a bird flu virus, for example, as we were just saying, public health authorities will say, oh, yeah, that doesn't matter because, these antibodies will not recognize the bird flu. No, this is wrong. They will not neutralize it, but they will bind to it. They can bind to it. And certainly, if these antibodies have been recently induced, because then the titers will be high. And these high titers can, to some extent, antibodies, high concentrated antibodies, can to some extent interact with this bird flu virus and could even enhance uptake into susceptible cells or even into cells we were just talking about is that do not have this specific receptor or that do not need to specifically recognize the receptor binding domain. So this receptor binding, this is very nice and clear if you have single, pure, isolated viral particles. If you start having aggregates, if you start having heterologous binding between virus and antibodies, then you can have this phenomena like antibody-dependent enhancement of infection, antibody-dependent enhancement of disease. And in my humble opinion, the few cases that are now, upon exposure to bird flu, contracting severe disease are not due to adaptation of this virus, because we know it has not adapted yet, but is rather most likely, I would say, due to the fact that for one reason, because these people got recently, for example, infected with seasonal flu, or maybe got vaccinated, that because of their high antibody titers and the interaction with this bird flu, you got antibody-dependent enhancement of infection or disease. And these are isolated cases. We know antibody-dependent enhancement of disease, these are isolated cases, not like these are large-scale disease patterns that you see. And so this is one striking example of how our public health authorities are completely incompetent, not understanding anything about these interactions and taking the wrong decisions with disastrous consequences. I'm always saying, look, I mean, you can be an anti-vaxxer or you can be a pro-vaxxer. Both parties agree on one single thing, and that is that vaccines can have a strong and lifelong effect. Of course, the anti-vaxxers will say that strong and lifelong effect is a detrimental effect. And the pro-vaxxers will say that lifelong and strong effect is a beneficial effect. We're not going to enter into these discussions, but they both agree that if you put the immune system, on a certain path and it gets primed, it will, do this for the rest of your life. And, if you simply vaccinate people without thinking what's going on in this ecosystem, I mean, then you are taking decisions that can harm the health of thousands, if not millions of people, right? And that is, for me, unbelievable. It's unbelievable that this is still happening today in our modern era of technological advances, right? Not
So
understanding the biology.
I want to pull you back a minute on this, Gert, because there are a lot of people who are completely losing faith in vaccines and the value of vaccines. So, say for instance, measles numbers are going down and so on. I want you to just explain to us, when you are thinking about preparing vaccines for a population, and in this case, forget this pandemic for a moment, but if you were anticipating something, how would you use a vaccine in that kind of context? What would you be the thinking? What should be the thinking? What should they be doing? So we find when you shouldn't do it in the middle of the pandemic, but how do you approach it? What would you say?
Well, it's very, very easy. What we can do in vaccinology today is extremely, extremely limited. Basically, people can keep in mind that the only thing we can do is that makes sense. That makes sense is to administer vaccines prophylactically, and that the only vaccines that really work are vaccines that induce antibodies. So basically, what that means is that you vaccinate people before they are going to be exposed to the pathogen, that is prophylactically in a preventive manner, and you make sure that their titers of antibodies, of neutralizing antibodies, are high enough before they get exposed, because if they are not high enough, you will not have the neutralizing capacity. So basically, the concept is almost the same like in with classical drugs. You know very well that if your drug doesn't reach a sufficient concentration in the blood, that it will not be efficient. Well, if your antibodies do not reach a sufficient concentration in the blood, and hence also in the mucosa, because there is some transudation also from the blood through the mucosa, the portals of entry. If that concentration is not sufficient, forget it. The virus will not, or the pathogen will not be neutralized, it will not be killed. And that would not be a bad thing if we had, I'm saying, if we had vaccines that can induce right away sterilizing immunity. So this would be vaccines that can kill virus-infected cells, before the virus can even start to reproduce in that cell, right? Then you could administer these vaccines during a pandemic. You could use them therapeutically. You could use them for chronic diseases, for example, because the pathogen would be replicating in the cell, or as soon as it enters the cell, and you have, for example, killer cells that before the pathogen can replicate would kill that cell, would recognize that cell, then this would be fantastic. Guess what? We don't have this type of vaccines. We don't have those vaccines, right? And even with a modern technology like mRNA or DNA, etc., it doesn't change anything in terms of the type of effector cells that we can induce and that kill. I'm not interested, no vaccinologist should be interested in vaccines. And that is what you read in all these publications that produce antibodies. I'm not interested in any antibody as a vaccinologist if it cannot neutralize my pathogen. I'm not interested in any T cell if it is not capable of killing a virus-infected cell. If you just produce T cells that have not this functionality, you're doing more harm than good, because these cells will start to interact with all kinds of different things, not being specific, not being able to kill pathogen infected cells or even pathogenically altered cells, like, for example, cancer cells. If your T cells don't do this, forget about this. And we don't have these T cell vaccines. Of course, vaccines induce CD4 T cells. Of course, they induce CD8 T cells. The CD4 T cells are the helper cells, and the CD8 T cells that we induce are, most of them are not cytolytic. And if they are cytolytic, they are haplotype restricted. So that means they work in just, certain haplotypes in people with a certain genetic background. If you want to do personalized vaccinology, okay, you can consider this, but this is certainly not the purpose in public or global health. Over.
So when we think about it now, then, one of the big challenges, and we can see it happening in the US, that's happening. You have individuals and groups that have been challenging the use of vaccines over long and the risks associated it. We're not getting to that bit, but what you've said there does register is very similarly to something that Professor Stabel Ben had said, which is that she was saying that the live vaccines, live attenuated vaccines, compared to when you use subunit vaccines and so on, like, which is what is being pushed at the moment, are like chalk and cheese. Where at the do you, or let me put it this way, do you think that at the moment your industry in terms of developing vaccines has now gone to a level where this is primarily about financial replication of intervention rather than really focusing on protecting the population from disease? Is this the is COVID the end stage, or the obvious presentation of this kind of financial rather than scientific and health based approach? You're in the industry. What is your thought?
Well, it's very, very clear that whereas in the past there was the famous risk benefit analysis, that has shifted obviously to a risk profit analysis, right? So, but again, I mean, in the vaccine industry, the business model is to make money and is to enrich the shareholders. That is the purpose. That is the goal of the pharmaceutical industry. That is the business model. So I'm always a little bit, well, not angry, a little bit disappointed maybe when the vaccine industry gets blamed, because what I'm saying is that, the guys who need to regulate this, so the regulators and also those who give the recommendations, if they don't give the recommendations, if there is no market, if there is regulatory wise, I mean, the clinical studies, the safety or the efficacy are not convincing, then these vaccines would never see the market. So I continue to blame for the huge disaster that has taken place, this mass vaccination, with all the consequences that we are just seeing now and already since quite some time. I mean, if the regulators and if the public health authorities would have understood what was going on, if the regulators would have done their job, I mean, this would not have happened, right? Of course, if you open the door to industry, I mean, you know what you're going to get. You are going to get this business model where it's all about money, right? And on top of this, they have seen here a huge opportunity to roll out a type of vaccines that they have been speculating could maybe be used in 10 or 20 years from now to treat, final stages of cancer or chronic diseases, but certainly not healthy patients, certainly not children, certainly not pregnant women, etc. So it has been all over the place. I mean, regulatory authorities, public health authorities, shame on you. Shame on you. Yeah.
Yeah, that is very important, Gerd. And I thought that if I asked you that honest question, you would give an honest answer, because where we are now is very frightening in the sense that the public disconnect from the scientific experts, so to speak, and the people who they should be listening to for guidance has shifted in such a way that I don't think anybody could have anticipated. Even the medical fraternity is caught up in this, where trust in doctors has dropped from 71% in 2020 to 40% in 2024. And this is having serious implications across the board. What does the public do now? Who do they listen to? It can't be just us on social media, I mean, we're it's good that we're talking, but we can't be the direction of the public. But outside of this, where do they go? What do they do?
Yeah, well, I think if you get this type of lack of confidence and distrust, uh, people just walk away from the whole thing. That is what I'm saying. That's what I'm hearing. People don't want to hear about this anymore, And unfortunately, we have come to an extremely polarized situation. I think, again, that public health authorities are largely responsible because, as I was just saying, every time there is an outbreak, they come with, infection prevention measures and, of course, the vaccines. And many people got to understand that the vaccines don't work. These vaccines don't work, and they cause harm, etc. So what you get in some of these groups is that they start to extrapolate this to all other vaccines. All the other vaccines is, it's crap because they are full of contaminants. They are not safe. They don't work. And you have seen it with the COVID vaccines. This was the super vaccine rolled out all over the world. And guess what? It's just a miserable situation. And that is also one of the reasons I pulled back largely from the social media, etc., because, we are here dealing with a very complex phenomenon, a very complex biological phenomenon. And what you see is polarization, to vaccinate or not vaccinate. In all regards, it's polarization, even in the scientific community. And what you get on top of this is also that people, not only see this in a very polarized way, but then they come also to conclusions that that are simply for which there is no scientific rationale, and you very often see then publications that just capture a snapshot. And for example, oh wow, the COVID-19 vaccinations they work. Look at the we got the hospitalization rate down, and also the mortality rate. And at some point during the COVID crisis, this was true. I mean, I'm the first to say that in terms of COVID-19, in terms of the disease, I'm not talking about the secondary effects, short-term and long-term, but in terms of the COVID-19 vaccines and disease, at some point, there was an impact, right? There was an impact, and there was also, for example, an impact on severe disease, but this was a snapshot. And I think in face of such a complex biological phenomena, scientific phenomena, polarization and the assessment and interpretation of snapshots are, for me, a hallmark of stupidity, right? Of stupidity. And we get plenty of this. We get plenty of this all over the place. It's black or white, and what we have seen is during the pandemic, things have so much evolved. The behavior of the virus, the characteristics of the virus have evolved. The immune system has evolved. We were just discussing about immune derailment. We have been discussing about the mutations, the evolution of the virus, etc. So people, public health authorities still don't see to understand that this is a very dynamic phenomenon where you have to analyze all the time, and what is true today is no longer true tomorrow. And if you start to polarize this and to give these clear-cut messages and you censor other viewpoints, etc., you shouldn't be surprised that people react just in the same way, but just pretending, of course, the opposite of the message that you are trying to convey. So I think a lot of people are no longer interested. Many people, unfortunately, think that all this talk about, the panzootic flu and about the surges now in seasonal flu and in RSV and you name it, that this is all crap, that it doesn't apply, it's not true. And that is unfortunate because it is true, but nobody's connecting the dots, certainly not public health authorities. They are not explaining it. They come with their stupid policies, with their stupid vaccination policies that are not that are out of context, not considering the full picture. And you shouldn't be surprised that people react in an increasingly, in fact, aggressive way. either aggressive or they just disconnect completely. So that is a very worrisome situation. We need people who are trying to connect the dots, who can explain this thing, because it's not like all these elements are completely independent. I mean, isn't this funny that all of a sudden we see all these chronic diseases, we see all these cancers, we see all this like long COVID, we see other acute cell infections that are popping up, all these things together. I mean, to me, it seems very logical if this happens, and this is reality, that you are, first of all, trying to find, is there a common ground? Is there a common ground, and is there a common origin of all this? Not doing this and just treating this separately, it's just going to increase the confusion and the lack of people to hear about this, to listen, and not following even the recommendations that may make sense. When I'm, for example, telling people now, please do not vaccinate, do not get vaccinated against RSV, do not get vaccinated against the seasonal flu. When they come with a pandemic flu vaccine, do not get vaccinated. And for God's sake, do not get vaccinated against SARS-CoV-2. Most likely, only very few people will believe me either, because, we are now just in a kind of field where people think, you just polarize and you have to choose whether it's black or white. And, Geert is saying not vaccinate, public health authorities say vaccinate. I have maybe some more credibility with certain people, and others will have much more, give public health authorities more credibility. And that is how they bet on a certain horse without really understanding what's going on, because nothing got explained. And that is the shortcoming and the fault of, public health authorities and also people in academia who are in their silos and don't see the forest for the trees. I see this in the publications, and then they come peer reviewed. I mean, peer reviewed, but they're missing the context. They're not seeing the forest for the trees, and then you make, of course, big mistakes. So it's very worrisome.
I want to pick your brain on one aspect that I know you have thoughts of and expertise in. We touched on it slightly, but I remembered something you said in our previous discussion, and I wanted to explore the thought, which is that you were saying that humans now seem to be putting the animal population at risk. And when we see these outbreaks occurring in the birds, in the cows, and everything else, do you think that this is in some way, as you said, interconnected? And the fact that we as humans, because of the mistakes and because of the mutations and because of the ongoing circulation, we are now putting the animal population at risk from our actions and behavior. I remember you saying that, and you were saying that at some point something has to give. Do you still think that? And how do you think that that will manifest?
Well, the way I see this is that, and the nicest example, and I wrote, I think, a couple of articles on this, is the fulminant expansion that you see, that we have seen, and that we still continue to see with, for example, the avian flu virus, so the panzootic. All of a sudden, I mean, the avian flu viruses are around for, already a long time, and they have always been considered a threat. But then since a couple of years ago, I think about 2 years ago, the expansion has just been huge, with now not only huge parts of the bird population that is affected, but even now other mammalian species. And so again, you can say, well, yeah, bird flu, we know it exists, etc. But yeah, why all of a sudden now all these mammalian, other mammalian species that are affected by bird flu. And I have some theories, some hypotheses that indeed the vaccination status of populations especially in industrialized countries that have been highly vaccinated, and I'm clearly talking about COVID-19 vaccination, I'm not talking about flu vaccination, but as I said, because of this, vaccination, we have had vaccine breakthrough infections a lot, and we have had immune refocusing. And one of the consequences of the immune refocusing has been that we have been activating T cells that can also eliminate cells that are infected, not just with SARS-CoV-2. By the way, that is what makes the infection acute self-limiting. Yeah? It's when the T cells kick in that will eliminate the virus-infected cell, and by doing that, you get rid of the viral infection. But this immune defense based on the cytolytic T cells can also, to some extent, eliminate cells that are infected by other viruses that also cause acute self-limiting viral infections, such as, for example, flu virus. So what does that mean practically? So what that means is that you are now making an infection that is usually symptomatic. You're making that infection asymptomatic because you have activated upfront cells that are also capable of eliminating cells that have been infected with, for example, bird flu. And so the reproductive phase, the reproduction of the virus, will of course be curtailed, will be abrogated when these cells interact, or when these T cells, cytolytic T cells, interact or kill the virus-infected cells. So more asymptomatic infections. More asymptomatic infections means automatically that you will have a huge spread of the virus. Mammals, whether it be birds, other mammalian species, humans that are sick don't move, or they can die, or they don't move. They have less contact, etc. They will not fly. When these are birds, for example. When it's not the case, when they are infected, but they have no symptoms or only mild symptoms, I mean, they just intermingle with all other species and the virus will spread enormously. Even though this bird flu virus is for most of these mammalian species and most of the birds not catastrophic, you will always have, cases where, of course, the infection breaks through the natural immunity and where you will have case fatality, so to say. Of course, the more birds or the more mammalian species that are infected, the more individuals that are infected, the higher the number of cases you will have that will also die from it. But so what I'm saying is that this explosion of pandemic flu and the explosive spread is, of course, causing a number of deaths in essentially birds, but other mammalian species will follow. And I am convinced that if this continues, we will see more cases also in humans that are sitting on high levels of heterologous antibody titers. We will see more cases of antibody-dependent enhancement of infection or antibody-dependent enhancement of disease. So that is also the reason why I'm recommending people to not vaccinate. And even natural infection, I think that it's estimated that about between 40 and 60% of U.S. citizens of U.S. population has antibodies against influenza. Now, I'm not saying that anybody who has antibodies against influenza will succumb to antibody-dependent enhancement of infection. It depends on the antibody titers. Many of these people will have lower antibody titers, will not harm. But of course, if you refresh this, if the flu is spreading more and more, then of course more people will have higher antibody titers, and this will increase the likelihood of this kind of diseases occurring. So it is true that through disturbing profoundly an ecosystem, what we have been doing by this mass vaccination, people shouldn't think this had no impact on other ecosystems. No, it is always the immune system that is involved. And there is some cross-reactive and some cross-protective activity between between the immune responses that are induced. And that is the reason I was saying, after immune refocusing, what you typically get after vaccine breakthrough infections, your immune response goes much larger. That is fine because you cover more variants, so to say, but the downside is that you also start, so to say, to protect partially, only partially, against other pathogens that then can spread asymptomatically because, you dampen the symptoms, and then you get a huge explosion, a huge spread of this virus in another ecosystem. And this is the COVID-19 or the SARS-CoV-2 human immune system ecosystem, human immune system, and the SARS-CoV-2 at the population level, which is indirectly now interacting with the avian bird, so the bird flu, in interaction with, of course, the immune responses in birds, can make it asymptomatic. Huge spread of avian flu virus comes back to humans, of course. It's an airborne infection. Humans sitting on high titers of flu antibodies, heterologous, can be susceptible, to antibody-dependent enhancement of infection. So you see, these interactions are complex, but they happen, and that is the reason why it's just more than like side effects with SARS-CoV-2. I'm not laughing about. I'm taking this very seriously. But the impact, the overall impact, when you do a thing like this at the population level, you can be sure that there will be an impact on other ecosystems that are, so to say, have overlapping immunity with the ecosystem that you were profoundly disturbing. Over.
So where we are now, as we come to tie things together, as I said, a lot of people, as you say, some people who listen to you trust your perspective, and other people listen to other people. But for the people who listen to you and who trust your guidance and your thoughts, when we think about where we are today, because at the moment it has the appearance of the fact that we've had three minor earthquakes, and there could be a major one coming, and everybody's just hoping that it doesn't happen rather than being systematic and being prepared about what is going to occur next. And so in terms of your perspective, what is it that people should be doing now from the risk point of view? You have a big cohort of our listeners are unvaccinated, and so their perception is they are fine for quite a lot of them. But then you have another group of people who may be partially vaccinated. So they had some vaccines and now they're questioning everything, but they don't know what to do because they have no guidance. What do people do now?
Well, for me, for the unvaccinated, it's very clear. I mean, I'm giving the example of what I'm doing, and what I'm recommending friends and family to do is to just keep in good shape and have a reasonable lifestyle. We know what it means. Not going to repeat is exercise, enough sleep, and no overweight and all these things. Very, very important. We got exposed, we got exercised, our innate immune system got trained. As you know, the innate immune system is not specific. So I'm not paying attention to anything except for this healthy lifestyle. So this, of course, does not include people who have severe underlying diseases, and does not include people who are thoroughly vaccinated. But even there, I would say for these people, it is critically important. So now we have an opportunity. There is an opportunity. So some people will remember that at some point I was recommending vaccinated people to get, measles or mumps or rubella vaccine. Measles vaccine, so to get one of those live attenuated vaccines. Why? Well, I was just explaining that their innate immune system has not been trained. There was a huge opportunity with COVID because it was circulating like hell. SARS-CoV-2 was circulating like hell, but as I was saying, in highly vaccinated populations, people either had antibodies and neutralized a lot of the virus, so there was not that much virus entered into the cells to train and stimulate that innate immunity. Or there were vaccine breakthrough infections, and the replication was so quick in those susceptible cells that there was not enough time to train the innate immunity. So I've never said that it was destroying. Some people pretended that I have been saying. I've never been saying that it destroyed the innate immune cells or whatever. So now, listen, this is important. People who got vaccinated have still another opportunity to train their innate immunity. Why? Well, RSV, flu, metapneumonia virus are circulating now. And I'm on one hand side, recommending people to not get vaccinated. And if people get infected, of course, they can get a disease. That is very clear. But this will stimulate their innate immune response and could really be a big help in avoiding a disaster that may happen when the virus mutates and escapes to the adaptive immune system. So this is one thing, with the exception, of course, of people that are immune suppressed. People that are immune suppressed, and we know these are people like transplants who take these immune suppressive drugs. These are people, for example, that have certain cancers, people with, chronic diseases. There is also the acquired immune deficiencies, HIV, etc. There are the genetically acquired or genetic immune diseases. There is also, for example, like diabetes type 1, etc. It's all clearly documented that these are underlying diseases that suppress the immune response. Those people, I would certainly not advise them to get exposed to the colds that are now circulating, but I would recommend them to take antivirals. Now, what people have to realize is when you start taking these antivirals for people who are immune suppressed, and vaccinated, you will have to take them for a long time. I mean, my fear is, to be open and honest, that you may need to take them lifelong. Why? Well, even if the pandemic comes to an end in the human species, we know, we were just talking about, that the animals, many animal species are a reservoir. So the human population can be reinfected with these, virulent viruses from the animal population. So that could be a risk. Those who don't have this immune suppression, they have now a unique opportunity to train their innate immune response, because the innate immune cells are completely competent. They have just been bypassed uh, during the acute phase of the pandemic. And in order to do this, in order to allow their innate immune system to have this kind of training that could be life-saving, they should, of course, not take antivirals. They should, of course, not mask, because then, of course, they are avoiding the exposure. And they should, of course, not get vaccinated against any of these acute self-limiting viral infections that are currently circulating. So that would be my advice, basically. Over.
That is fascinating, Gert. So,
Mm.
in a sense, one of the things that I picked up there, and I think that is very relevant, is that fundamentally, the better your mucosal immune system is from actual multiple exposures. That's a very good point, meaning that even if it is the RSV virus, once it's triggering your immunity, it will add extra protection against most other viruses because it will train your immune system. So, in a sense, you are telling people not to be afraid unless they have underlying health conditions.
Well,
Um,
yeah, but Philip, so people will ask me, and I will give a very clear answer. I'm specifically making the exception for people, that are immune suppressed, be it genetically, be it acquired through another disease, be it by the drugs they are taking. But people, for example, that have long COVID, but are not immune suppressed, people who have developed autoimmunity and all these type of things, very clearly, unless people with autoimmunity take immune suppressive drugs, but if they don't, they are not immune suppressed. My recommendation of exposure also applies to these people, right? The only exception are the people that are immune suppressed. And, you can look up what these categories are, but not for the others. So it's not because you're long COVID, because you have autoimmune diseases, etc., unless you're taking immune suppressive drugs, which is the case for a number of people, of course, right?
no, no. So, as we close up, just to tie up some important points here, one of the concerns at the beginning of the pandemic was that we were trying to technically almost save all lives. And this is why the lockdown happened. This is why they tried to vaccinate everybody, especially the high risk and so on. I am getting the impression that in the context of a pandemic, you have to acknowledge that lives will be lost, but what you are looking at is the bigger picture as the longer term outcomes at population level. Is that about right in terms of how you are thinking?
Yes, of course. And that has been the huge problem. I was just alluding to this when I said, that those who not only polarize, but base their assessments on snapshots, that is a hallmark of stupidity. So I am not interested into a situation that may seem favorable, but which I know for sure is in the longer term not going to be favorable anymore. None of these situations has been stable. We have seen how all of a sudden, health systems or hospitals were overloaded. Some of them were no longer taking patients, for example. Now we are seeing the same, with the surge of RSV and influenza, seasonal influenza, and metapneumonia virus, etc. We are seeing the same thing. And of course, you can do something, and here comes the word, to temporarily mitigate this. But if you don't solve the origin of that problem, and every doctor, will know this, the disadvantages of symptomatic treatment, not going to the cause, to the root of the problem, but just treating the symptoms. and doing as if nothing were, as if it would resolve, just by itself. I treat the symptoms, and you know what? This thing is going to go away. You don't know what the cause is. That doesn't work. I'm only interested in solutions that will have a final stage that has a beneficial effect. And we are not there yet, because what that means is that the final stage will very simply be reached when those, who have no immunity left, unfortunately, have been eliminated by the virus. And when those who have strengthened their immunity will eliminate the virus. And that will be the end of the pandemic. And we are not there yet, but any situation on this path that is unstable, or that looks stable, but it isn't stable. We have right now a situation that to many people looks stable. We know it's not stable. We call this metastable. It's a temporary equilibrium, but it's going to evolve. And that is how some people, some public health authorities even, or so to say, leave people with the impression that the pandemic is coming to an end because we are seeing less hospitalizations due to SARS-CoV-2, mortality due to SARS-CoV-2 is still relatively low, wastewater levels are still relatively low, etc. So for them, it's a transition to, the endemicity, the virus. On the other hand, we know very well that the virus is still evolving, and that the trick that the virus is now implementing is that it transmits through asymptomatic or mild infections. People who develop still these infections, very often they are mild, they can be prolonged, etc. But these people are not necessarily in bed. These people are not necessarily hospitalized, so they are in society. They spread the virus. And secondarily, the virus is highly, highly infectious. The SARS-CoV-2 virus is highly infectious. So even if the shedding is reduced, because big chunks of the virus are now just sitting on migratory dendritic cells, I'm explaining this in my course, in my book, etc. So it's taken out a lot of the viral load, and so the wastewater levels is relatively low, but the virus is still highly infectious. It's asymptomatically transmitted, but it has more and more difficulty, of course, to transmit, which puts the transmission of the virus under huge pressure. And we have seen all the mutations right now that still occur, or improving, so to say, the transmission. But this pressure is not going to go away. The only way to relieve it is if what I'm saying is going to happen, that those who can still contain the virus by kind of sterilizing immunity will eliminate it. And those who cannot do this, they will, I mean, that is for me very clear. They will get eliminated by the virus, so the other way around. But again, what I'm saying is that right now, there is an opportunity for those who got vaccinated, didn't get the live attenuated vaccines recently, to simply get exposed to what is circulating, to not vaccinate, to not mask, and and of course only under the condition that they are not immune suppressed. I know this is very sober what I'm saying, but if I were a public health authority, I would not be allowed to say this. But this is the only reality on how you can end this pandemic. You have to stop the transmission. Nothing right now is stopping the transmission. You don't stop the transmission, this thing goes on, you get reinfected, the chronic diseases based on this immune dysregulation will just continue, you get more excess deaths, you will get more cancers, you name it, and the thing is still going on. This will not be the end of the pandemic. Mitigation is not a solution; it's a snapshot. This ecosystem will evolve towards a situation where nature will re-establish a sound equilibrium between these pathogens, and the immune system, the human immune system at a population level. But it will come with a price to pay, because we have messed up miserably this ecosystem by the faulty infection prevention measures that we took at the beginning of the pandemic, and then followed by the mass vaccination campaign. So Africa will win.
I think they have won. Yes, yes, yes. Very sobering,
Yeah.
Geert. And I know that as you were speaking, and I reflected on what you were saying, I saw the truth of what you were saying is that there is no way out except that those who continue to transmit the virus at some point will end up being eliminated by nature in order to reach balance. That is extremely sobering. And it's very sobering because when I reflect on the kind of numbers that we're talking about, those numbers are huge compared to what we would have
Yeah.
faced
Yeah.
if we had just faced the
Yeah.
pandemic.
Yeah.
And that is very, very
Yeah.
sobering when you think about it.
But there is one thing I would still, I almost forgot to say this, but this is very, very important, because it is one of the reasons why I've been silent for some time. I could not explain why my timeline was wrong. And so I've been torturing my brain to understand this, why we have this pause right now. So this is important. But then what I concluded now, what I concluded is, because we have this pause where, we are not building additional immunity, and where part of the virus, is like parked on dendritic cells, and the thing is not really like moving forward very fast. For me, it is now very clear, and this is important, that no single methodology, no single modeling, no single way of tracking the virus, the sequences, no single surveillance of wastewater levels, of hospitalization rates, of death rates, no single parameter will be able or can be used to predict when this moment will come. And this is simply because we cannot measure the immune pressure on the virus to proceed to a more transmissible intra-host transmission variant. But what experts, who were in favor of the vaccination, are clearly saying, and I can share these publications, is that they expect the virus now no longer to transmit from one host to the other, but within the host, intra-host. That's exactly what I'm saying. And what they are saying is that we hope that will not have, or that will not increase the virulence of the virus. We have been lucky for now, and we hope that our luck will hold, right? And that is literally what they are saying. So we cannot measure that pressure on the virus. And secondarily, we don't know even if we could measure that pressure, how high or low this threshold of pressure should be or can be for the virus to tolerate. What is the threshold where the virus will no longer, this threshold of pressure, of immune pressure on the virus, that the virus will no longer tolerate? We don't know this. And for this reason, I was just speculating that the exponential curve would continue, that we would very rapidly reach the virulence. Now I found that there is a pause that I can now biologically explain. But when this will change into a hyperacute event that I'm calling the tsunami, we don't know. And I challenge anybody to come now with a timeline or with a modeling or with an idea on what exactly will happen. I'm sure that no single methodology, even living in an era of modern technology, No single methodology of sequencing, sequence tracking, surveillance will be able to predict this. That is something very important I think I wanted to add.
Yes, thank you very, very much, Gert. And yeah, we've got a lot of people who are listening, and I think the main takeaway from this is that there has to be a price to pay.
Mm.
And I can see that there is no way not to have that price to pay. The price may have been lower at the beginning of the pandemic, but we would have gotten beyond it faster. Where we are now suggests that that price may be much higher at a population level. And there is no easy way to get out of that outcome. But the truth is, we do not know the time.
Yeah.
And if there is any intervention that can be activated at this time, based on what you are saying, for people, if they could get that live attenuated vaccine just to stimulate immunity, that would be good for people to protect with potentially lifelong antivirals. But this is, yes, you're right. It's an untenable position where we
Yeah.
have such high circulation. I can see what you mean.
Mm.
It cannot.
Any, yeah,
Mm,
any additional exposure to the circulating viruses now, influenza, RSV, etc., will of course increase the pressure on the virus. Why? Because if these people, thanks to their exposure, also develop this, or train their innate immune response, this trained innate immune response that is non-specific will further cut down the transmission of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, right? So that will put even more pressure on the virus. So that will accelerate this moment where we can expect a tsunami. All vaccinations against those diseases and all masking will simply delay this moment because it will make it for the virus less difficult to transmit because its propagation will not be hindered by trained innate immunity that is developing, and that will take out a lot of the circulating SARS-CoV-2 virus. So when we start to vaccinate, when we start to mask, which will probably happen, we will just be delaying this. We will just be delaying this moment. If we would not do this, we would have certainly, I think, within a pretty short time frame, but I'm not going to make any predictions anymore. Within a pretty short time frame, we would be eliminating a lot of the circulating SARS-CoV-2 virus that is already struggling right now and is under pressure on its transmissibility, right? So these are the kind of dots that people need to connect, our public health authorities, to understand what is going on and to be prepared to the event. But again, I'm kind of like saying that the first who get exposed will be the first that have a chance being vaccinated to overcome this, because they will have developed this trained innate immunity before the tsunami comes. And the advent of the tsunami will be accelerated by more and more people getting exposed to these now circulating viruses,
yeah.
because it will train their innate immunity and eliminate also SARS-CoV-2, because trained innate immunity is non-specific and it works against several acute self-limiting viral diseases.
Wow. Powerful stuff as usual, Gert. Thank you very, very much. We've had a good conversation here, got a chance to explore quite a lot of thoughts. I hope my audience found this as valuable as I did. It is, as usual, sobering, but as we can say, that the truth is that you have been, I can't think at the moment, other than when you said times, Your predictions, however, have almost always been spot on. And that's sad, but we have to learn to accept that reality. And if anything, prepare for it. So have a great evening, everyone. Remember, look in the description. There is a link for Voice for Science and Solidarity, which is linked to Geert, as well as some of my books and presentations. So look out for more information, and we'll continue to keep you updated. Have a great evening, everyone. Thank you. And if Geert, you'll just wait with me for the outro. Thank you all.